Good afternoon, everyone. Looks like everyone's excited to talk tax today, so the gallery is full. We do have a full schedule, so I'll try to keep moving right along here. Are there any requests for bill introductions? Representative Helgerson.
Mr. Chairman, the number is RS 1612. It is a technical cleanup for the Salt Parity Act that was passed last year.
Okay. Thank you, committee. Any questions? Any objections? Seeing none, the request is approved. Are there any further requests for bill introductions? Seeing none, we will move on to our first item of business for today, and that is a hearing on Senate Bill 169. And I would turn first to the revisor's office for an overview, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senate Bill 169 will impose a single income tax rate starting in tax year 2024, and this would be applied to individuals at the rate of 4.75%. This tax rate would be applied against the Kansas taxable income that would be in excess of $10,450 for married individuals filing joint returns and $5,225 for all other individuals. And with that, I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you, Adam. This bill doesn't touch any changes on standard deduction or exemptions.
That is correct. It has no change.
Committee, any questions for the revisor? Seeing none, we'll move on to our fiscal note and welcome Department of Revenue for an overview on that.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, Kathleen Smith with the Department of Revenue. Department of Revenue is estimating that Senate Bill 169 would decrease state general fund revenues by $170.4 million in fiscal year 2024, $568.5 million in fiscal year 2025, and $574.2 million in fiscal year 2026. Fiscal year 2024 is just a little bit lower because that only includes 30% of tax year 2024 when it goes into effect. With that, Mr. Chairman, I would stand for questions.
Thank you, Kathleen. Committee, are there any questions for Department of Revenue regarding the fiscal note? We are a talkative committee today, aren't we? Okay, thank you, Kathleen. At this time, we'll go ahead and open up the proponent section of testimony for Senate Bill 169. And I have listed first Dan Murray. Is he here yet? I know he had another committee he had to go to. We'll pass over him and come back. Next on the list would be Michael Austin with Americans for Prosperity. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Michael Austin. I'm the Coalitions and Legislative Director for Americans for Prosperity Kansas. An economist by trade, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today in favor of Senate Bill 169. One of the many reasons I think this bill should be considered is because it has been long past time that Kansans have had any real sort of relief. Since 2015, we have seen a sales tax hike. We've seen a number of income tax hikes. In 2017, we've seen the largest tax increase in state history, reversing the 2013 tax reform package. And since then, we haven't really done anything. But since then, we've seen record amounts of inflation, of course, coming from the federal government and the Federal Reserve. And that has created a very unique and unfortunate situation for Kansas residents where they are pushed into a higher tax bracket, and yet they can't buy any extra goods and services, yet they'll be paying a higher tax for it regardless. Coming down to a single tax rate obviously makes it simpler, but it also helps prevent from any type of this inflation bracket creep from happening again. And so it's one way that we can not only, of course, provide tax relief, but also, create an environment where no matter what happens, no matter who's president or what federal spending or what the Federal Reserve is going to do, at least in terms of inflation, there will not be an increased tax burden on Kansans simply because of our tax code. Also, I think it's important to recognize that while the fiscal note for this bill ranges from about $570 million, I think it's completely affordable. Remember, going into this 2023 session, we were looking at about a $1.8, $1.9 billion surplus. If you take into consideration the governor's recommendation going out into the out years, she has, of course, an increase in the budget stabilization fund and an ending balance of about $1.8 billion. That means if you take this SB 169 and pass it, you would only reduce that ending balance to about $1.4 billion and still maintain a much higher budget stabilization fund with, of course, extra room to spare. So if there's anybody who's saying that this is not affordable, I think it most certainly can be done, and the math shows that it can. And last but not least, on this SB 169, I think it's very important that we put out a tax policy that not only gives people a tax cut, but helps our most vulnerable Kansans. And the way that this works out, if you look at the written testimony I provided you for this hearing, there's a lovely little table there where it breaks down that for individual single filers making a little less than $11,000, they wouldn't pay any state income taxes at all. Everybody else gets a pay raise. So I think that this is something that is most certainly feasible for the legislature to consider, and most certainly should be considered, because we want to do what we can to help the most vulnerable Kansans out there. And of course, I stand for any questions, and I thank you for the time.
Thank you. Committee will go ahead and hold questions until the very end of the section of the testimony.
Thank you very much
for your testimony. Next, I'd like to welcome Eric Stafford with the Kansas Chamber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify in support of Senate Bill 169. My name is Eric Stafford with the Kansas Chamber. And similar to previous bills that you guys have heard before, we believe that it's greatest time as any to cut taxes and income taxes. Similar data that we've provided before in terms of the current rate structure, the current adjusted gross income, share of the state and tax liability from our tax foundation report for tax year 2016. Overall, the one thing that I would add is that we would like to see and continue to express our support for a growth trigger to allow for future rate reductions over time, to continue to push to get Kansas in a more competitive position. Just want to note that on the 12th, there was a editorial board piece in the Wall Street Journal that is headed, the headline is "Getting to a Zero Tax Rate in Arizona." And so they are pushing they have a state senator mentioned in here who's pushing that their state voters choose on whether or not they continue to, in Arizona, lower income tax rates. So their legislature cut their flat rate. They're a flat single rate state of used to be 4.5%. Now they're 2.5%. And voters in 2024 will decide whether they want to approve a growth trigger to take population and inflation metrics, and then anything over that in terms of a budget surplus would be used to cut income taxes. I haven't seen the exact language of how that functions, but ultimately being able to continue to position their state in a much more competitive position is good. But as other states do more, then we have to also do more so we can catch up. So appreciate the opportunity to be here in tax again. Happy Monday, happy March Madness week, and good to see everybody.
Thank you for your testimony. I do not see Mr. Murray back in here yet. So at this time, committee will go ahead and open it up to questions for the proponents. Representative Helgerson first.
Mr. Stafford, please. You and I have had several conversations about this bill. There are two main hurdles that I'd like you to touch on. One is explain why you believe that low-income individuals should pay the same rate, or lower-income individuals, as opposed to someone that's a millionaire. Because so many of my colleagues say it's not fair for a $50,000 income to pay the same rate as a $1 million individual. And I think it'd be helpful to have that discussion.
Yeah, appreciate the question, Representative, and good to see you. And we have had some good discussions on tax policy. I think when we look at fairness, we should look at what's actually being paid, not what rate they're paying at. And 4% on all income is about as fair as you can get, or 4.95, 4.75, whatever the rate is that the legislature ultimately decides that we want to go with in terms of a single rate. So no matter what you earn, you're looking at in my opinion, those who are making that argument are looking at the wrong end of the spectrum. They should be looking at the total taxes paid, not the rate. And fairness is fairness. 5% is 5%, whether you earn 15 million or whether you earn $15.
So your argument is in part that encouraging individuals that are making higher dollars to work here and live here and try to make more money is advantageous to the state, because that's the source of our income taxes. Our income taxes are paid, what is it? I'm trying to anybody remember what the percentage is of the
What percentage they're paying their share of tax liability?
They have the higher share. Those
So I would say over $100,000, according to this data from tax year 2016, that was used in our tax foundation report that came out in December of 2019. So that was lagging a few years to get the data put in. But over $100,000 pays, what would that be? 62% of the tax burden in the state of Kansas. Those who are,
Okay.
and I don't know what percentage that makes up in terms of share of adjusted gross income, 60% share of adjusted gross income.
And would you add on a little bit more explanation about what you call the growth trigger? Not everybody may be familiar with it.
Sure. And I will, if you don't mind, Representative and Mr. Chairman, I don't think I necessarily answered one of your questions that was dealing with the argument as to why. And yes, in allowing individuals to keep more of their hard-earned money. And Tax Foundation just last night came out with a map of what is the total state and federal combined tax rate. We're 29th. We're in decent shape, mediocre, middle of the pack. When you look at the top marginal rate that could be paid. And so we're still under 50%, but we're getting close. I think we're at 44%, if I remember right from that chart. So for business owners who file on the personal level, or even corporations, but this bill doesn't address the corporate income tax rate, allowing businesses to have a lower tax burden allows them to pay higher wages, reinvest profit into their business. Profit's not a bad thing. You get taxed on profit, but allowing them to reinvest in their business, that's also an economic advantage of lowering taxes. But to the growth trigger, the purpose behind that, and North Carolina is who we modeled the growth trigger off of in House Bill 2061 that you guys had a hearing on earlier this year. North Carolina was top 10 worst business climates in the country until 2012, 2013, when they passed income tax reform. So they've gotten their single rate income tax down to close to 5%. I can't remember if they're under or at 5%, but right around 5%. They've gotten their corporate income tax rate down to 2.5%. And so what they do, they put in every few years, they put in the dollar amounts into the statute. They update it. Whatever comes in over that will be used to buy down personal and corporate income tax rates until they get to zero. So they've been doing that now for 10 years. So there are many ways that you can structure that. You can structure it where you look at dollar amounts. There are ways you can structure it to where you look at percentage of growth. You can structure it to where if there's a recession and we dip below a certain point, so say this bill passes and our SGF becomes 8.5 billion round numbers, right? If we drop below that because of a recession, the trigger doesn't go into effect. But then once you start getting over that, you are allowed 2% growth or 2.5% growth or 1% growth, whatever the legislature decides. Anything over that would be utilized to lower income tax rates until whatever the legislature set, 0, 2, 3, 4, 4.5, 5, whatever, but it allows for future reductions based on, it's still allowing for growth of receipts, but anything over what was expected or what was achieved in that cap dollar figure or percentage figure set by the legislature will be used for further reductions to help continue to get Kansas to be in a more competitive position. That's the concept behind those growth triggers.
Thank you.
Next question, Representative Clayton.
Well, my microphone isn't working, but I'm just right now. But I guess for the benefit of people there, and Mr. Stafford, I apologize. I am going to not allow you to sit down, so just consider it getting your steps in. So, all right. So when you mentioned the growth trigger, for a moment I became a little bit unwell and was afraid that I might faint due to the potential comparison that we have to the ill-fated 2012 bill. So can you explain to me, you mentioned in your testimony, you were happy to work on language that would satisfy concerns over structure and implementation. I know you explained some of that. Help me understand how your potential proposal or whatever amendments will come up in committee, as I have no doubt they will. I know that you're a man that has plans. So explain to me the difference between this and 2013. I tend to believe a little bit more in sustainable solutions and real revenue reform. So let's walk me through this.
So 2012, legislature passed a bill that was put together. They eliminated a lot of the pay-fors. The plan proposed by Governor Brownback at the time would phase out taxes on small business pass-through entities. What ultimately passed was an immediate move to 0% on pass-through entities, and we collapsed Kansas's three bracketed system to a 2-bracketed system. But like I said, a lot of the pay-fors that were included in the original bills that were stuck in conference committee were stripped from the bill to where it was just very costly, and then moving it to 0 right away obviously made it more costly. But there was no growth trigger for future buy-downs of income taxes. I think that was discussed at the time. Senate President Ty Masterson, I think 2010, 2011, introduced Senate Bill 1 that was entirely nothing but a growth trigger to have a certain percentage of growth of state receipts and then use that to buy down income taxes after you achieve that level. But then what passed was in 2012 that was much different than that.
And can you assure me that in the event that this gets passed, that we won't see an increase in sales taxes? I mean, I still remember, seeing people crying when they were voting. Usually if a bill makes you cry, vote no, right? That's the rule. But I mean, is this going to lead to things that will force my colleagues to potentially take sales tax increase or even property tax increase votes? I have to think about the well-being of not only my constituents, but of my colleagues, and want to look after everyone. So what can you tell me about that?
I can't tell you anything about the future, Representative. If I could, I'd be betting a lot more on sports that I continue to lose on a daily basis. But nobody knows what the future holds. But I know that from the expertise from the Tax Foundation and the comments that they've made to this committee and to us working on the study, that they put together for us, they often refer to structural tax policy. And I think that's where the focus has been this past session, is more on the structural tax policy, the rates and potential pay-fors, growth triggers. In doing so, and then full disclosure, Tax Foundation said that they didn't like our growth trigger because we refer to any revenue over the consensus revenue estimates. And it was our decision to draft it that way only because how do we mesh, we were short on time, and how do we mesh the dollar figures that they have versus our SGF and structure, and knowing that we would have time during the legislative process to vet those types of questions. So I can't promise you what would happen in the future, but I think having structural reforms, lowering rates obviously is going to reduce revenues, but ultimately we have to grow as a state. And the more people you have here, the more revenue you will get. And so we have to create a plan that encourages investment in the state, that would attract investment and attract businesses here, and to help those businesses that are already here grow, so we can hire more people and have more people living in our great state.
Thank you. And I agree. I think that one thing that we can look at that North Carolina has also done is expanding Medicaid, which will also help grow the state and create more jobs. Thank you so much. And thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next question, Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to hear from both proponents, so we can start with you, Eric. Um, so what basically is being proposed here is a single rate. Walk me through how we came up with 4.75, or is it more important to you that it's a single rate and the number isn't that important?
This, I believe, was introduced by Senator Tyson. So this was not our bill to start. So I don't know the logic behind what the rates were set at or the conversations that took place to put everything together. So I don't know the answer to that question.
But you're definitely in favor of the concept regardless of the number.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that speaks to Representative Helgerson's question that what is fair? And if a single rate is very fair, the conversations that have taken place on the potential impact on low income individuals, is it unfair that they're getting into the second and third tier very quickly? I mean, we have a very progressive income tax bracket today to get into that top rate as a single filer, getting up to 30,000. So going to a lower single rate for everybody that's the same, I think that just expresses just in terms of the fairness and competitiveness, which is why you've seen so many states move to that over the last few years.
Thank you. So, Mr. Austin, do you have any insight as to why 4.75% was picked? And again, like I asked Mr. Stafford, are you in favor of the concept regardless of the number?
Thank you very much for your question, Representative Sanders. I think I will echo the prior conferee, Mr. Stafford's comments on the specific number of 4.75. That came from the Senate side, and I, of course, was not in the room as to the decision to make it that particular number over 4.5% or higher at 5%. But to speak to the overall concept of a single tax rate or of a flat tax, going back from my classical economic teaching, Milton Friedman talked about, at least on the national level, about the fairness, of course, of going to a flat tax system. And not only, of course, because it's simple, everybody can easily calculate what their tax rate will be with their taxes will be with one single rate. But he also, of course, advocated for increasing the standard deduction, creating that 0% type bracket, so the very low income, the most vulnerable among us aren't, seeing that increased liability. And so SB 169, to my view, kind of follows into that notion. So yes, we of course support this bill and would like to see it pass.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Next question, Representative Corbett.
Thank you. This will be for either one of you. And Eric, you kind of hit on it a little bit, but I kind of see this as a pro-growth bill. I mean, and I'm hoping this would stop the outward migration of Kansans, and maybe if people are thinking about moving here, I think this would be a good leg of the stool to come to Kansas for. How do you see that, Michael?
I see tax policy being one of many different reasons as to why people leave. Some people leave just because that's where their grandkids are and they want to be near their grandkids as they go into their next stage of life. Others want job opportunities, and so there's a particular industry in a certain area. But what, of course, we've always, have seen, it doesn't matter whether you're looking at it statewide or whether you're looking at entire, countries. People, of course, tend to move to areas that are cheap. Right? Cheap to live. And of course, taxes play a role in how cheap an area is to live. So if there is something that we can do on the income tax side to bring down that burden, we should most certainly pursue it. And then, as we of course know, in the last year and a half, there's been about 5 to 7 states that have decided to simplify their tax system and lower the rates because they want to be competitive. So not only were we competing against, other states just simply on tax burden, but now other states around us are doing things similar and making their tax codes simpler and cheaper for residents to come there and move. So I think that's just another reason why we should follow suit.
Thank you. Committee, any further questions? Representative Stogstill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is for Mr. Stafford. Thank you. You talked about the growth factor that you would like to see built into this. What happens if there's no growth? what happened? Do we have a shrinking factor in this as well that would be triggered if the revenues or our state budget went down instead of up? Because I think we're counting on this going up under this plan. And I know in 2016, I was elected in a district that was 67% registered Republicans. And I basically ran on getting rid of the previous administration's tax plan. And I'm very concerned that this seems to me to be along that same line. And if it is, what kind of trigger do we have if it starts going south?
Sure. Yeah, good question. And thank you, Representative. Always very well thought out questions. And to the first part of that question in terms of, what happens if it goes negative. I spoke to that earlier to Representative Clayton, that you can structure it in a way, you can put the dollar amount. That's where I was saying that, say we have $9 billion SGF and then this bill passes and you cut it down to 8.5, that's your benchmark. Anything below that then doesn't, if our revenues drop below that, the trigger doesn't go into effect. Once you get past that point, achieve 2% growth, then those numbers will have to be adjusted to then say that that's your benchmark. Then you have the growth, you cut over that amount, and then you start over. And so you can always adjust to prevent that type of situation that you're talking about. In terms of, again, 2012, this is entirely different than 2012. 2012, 2013, 14, 15, 16, and what passed, and the budget, people didn't necessarily vote against lower taxes. They voted against, 34 months of consensus revenue estimates missing the mark, and the legislature and the governor's office not adjusting spending according to that. And so there were just structural imbalances. Spending rose by $800 million. They cut $700 million of taxes out. We can sit here on paper and do the math pretty quick what structurally is going to happen to the state of Kansas. So yes, I do think that there are, with the growth trigger, there are those types of protections that you can build. Again, when we talk about structure, what structure can we look at? Tax Foundation's talked about this many times, and they're a great resource, but those are the types of structural parts that they would like to make sure that if the state's going to go that route, they would recommend that those be included, and that's perfectly fine because of the questions you're raising. So I think those issues and concerns could be overcome, but I think going to a single rate is entirely different than what happened in 2012. But again, I don't think voters necessarily were opposed to lower taxes. They were just opposed to the constant imbalance of revenues versus expectations versus spending.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Final question, Representative Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is for either one of the proponents. There was number one, what is the length to input, to get this active, to change to a flat tax? How many years do you think it would take to get it through? And then the second one is, when we talk about ease of being able to find what your taxes is, how will this affect exemptions to income tax? So we have out there right now that people can, different exemptions are there. Will it do away with those exemptions? How will that affect that?
On that second question, I'll admit that might be a better question for Department of Revenue. To my knowledge and my view, looking at this bill, I don't believe it touches those exemptions, but I could always be corrected. Would the chair like to have Department of Revenue up to answer that particular question?
Well, we have a number of exemptions. We have a standard deduction. We have the personal exemptions. We also have in tax code right now a kind of a zero liability threshold at $2,500 and $5,000. So those numbers remain unchanged. Any additional deductions or tax credits, all those things remain in place. They are still eligible to qualify for those. This is just a change in that structured rate.
Thank you. And I apologize again. Would you mind repeating the first question? I was walking up when you said it.
Yeah. So how long the process to implement this, to get into effect? How many years will it take to actually to have this fully in effect as a flat rate? Is it a 2-year process, 3-year process to get it from where we are today with a 3-tier system into a 1 flat rate system? Is there a time frame that we're looking at to do that?
I think that might be another question for Department of Revenue. But I believe their fiscal note looked at 30% of that tax cut coming in the most immediate fiscal year, and then full implementation by the next year. But I could always be corrected if I'm mistaken.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. It is an immediate change. This isn't a phase in to the single rate. It would go immediately from those three brackets that we currently have right now to the single bracket or single rate. Okay, in the interest of time, committee, I think we'll go ahead and move on to the opponent section testimony, and welcome first to committee, Emily Fetch. Welcome to committee.
Good afternoon, Chairman Smith and members of the committee. My name is Emily Fetch, and I'm the Director of Fiscal Policy at Kansas Action for Children. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today in opposition to Senate Bill 169. We oppose this bill due to its regressive structure that will overwhelmingly benefit high-income Kansans. This proposal would drain revenue at a time where childcare, healthcare, and special education continue to remain underfunded. While this proposal taxes nearly all taxpayers at the same rate, it's not a fair tax as it would primarily benefit the highest income Kansans. The lowest income tax filers would receive an average tax cut of less than $50, while the top 1% would receive an average tax cut of nearly $13,000. Said another way, 70% of the benefit would go to the top 20%. That's households that make more than $131,000 a year. Even with the current graduated income tax structure, the total effective tax rate for the highest income Kansans is substantially lower than for other income groups. You can see it in my written testimony, but the lowest 20% of Kansans in terms of percentage of their income have an effective total tax rate, that's property sales and income, of 10.7%, while the top 1% has an effective tax rate of just 7.4%. If proposals like these are implemented, they could create an environment where other taxes, property taxes, sales taxes, would very likely need to be increased to make up for the declining income tax contributions. And those changes can end up costing low and middle income Kansans far more than the average tax cut that they would receive from this proposal. So in conclusion, Kansas Action for Children opposes a flat tax like Senate Bill 169, and I'm happy to stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you for your testimony. Our next opponent is Timothy Graham with Kansas NEA. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to be in front of you. My name is Tim Graham. I'm one half of the government relations team at KNEA, Kansas National Education Association. We are opposed to 169. I've been before this committee already once this year talking about a similar bill, so I'm going to try not to repeat myself. I'm going to try to be quick. Based on what's in the bill, we oppose this because of fairness and feasibility. Let's talk about fairness for a second. There's a debate that's as old as taxes itself that says that a flat income tax is regressive in nature. That school of thought believes it creates a higher burden on the wage earner at the lower end of the spectrum. And Senate Bill 169 is certainly falls into that category. So that's one of the reasons why we oppose that, just that little portion of fairness right there. I do also want to talk about the fact that in my testimony, I state that the minimum taxable income under 169 is $15,001. Reading this bill, that number is actually 5,226 is the trigger. Now, I was convinced at the first reading of this bill that $15,000 was the fiscal floor that would trigger a tax. However, I may just be conflating that with House Bill 2061. But here's the interesting thing about that. Whether we're talking about this bill or whether we're talking about 2061, it seems like the debate over managing the fiscal note, in other words, keeping that fiscal note down, is how much are we going to tax those lower earners so we can afford it, as opposed to how much are we going to tax the higher earners so we can afford it. So that's what's interesting about the whole debate here, is that we're talking openly about the fact that we need to manage the fiscal note on this because the fiscal note is too big because we're giving too much of a tax break on the lower end and not worrying about the people that are at the higher end of the spectrum. Now, let's say you're not part of the school of thought that a flat tax is regressive and unfair. If you're not part of that school of thought, then I'm not going to change your mind here today. So let's just talk about the fiscal impact. When I originally wrote my testimony on this when it was heard on the Senate side, there wasn't a fiscal note out yet. We've heard the fiscal note today. 174 million in fiscal year 24, 568 million in fiscal year 25 and counting. That concerns us because we are very, very concerned about the fiscal impact that this bill would have on the financial of the Kansas budget because of how that funds schools and funds the school districts where our teachers are working and teaching our children. So in closing, a lot of people say we can do this without cutting any programs. If education, if infrastructure, if public safety and social services are to remain intact without those cuts, where's the tax shift going to go? Is it going to go to property? Is it going to go to sales? Is it going to go somewhere else? If education, infrastructure, public safety, and social services are going to remain intact without a tax shift, then what programs are going to be cut to afford this? And if revenue surpluses alone are the genesis for such a tax policy, what happens when the surpluses shrink or even worse, become non-existent? What are we going to do? So here's the real closing, okay? This seems very familiar. And this is a time where a political person, I told you guys this last time, this is a time when a political person gets up and invokes the name of the former governor and points fingers at that administration, or this is the time where we poke fingers at the former Senate president, the former minority leader. Let's just be honest here. There's a lot of blame to go around for the situation we got ourselves in the past decade. Let's not go there again. And for a little history lesson, I know there's 2 members of this committee that were here in 98. The same thing happened in 98 with Senate Bill 500. We had a fight over taxes because of what was going on in the primary season that year in the elections. We went way too far on cutting, and we turned right back around and had to make a revenue adjustment in the early portion of this decade. And I'm not telling you this because I was told this. I was here to watch it. So that's my close, and I'm open for questions.
Thank you for your testimony. Our last in-person conferee would be Donna Ginther. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. My name is Donna Ginther. I am a professor of economics, and I direct the Institute for Policy and Social Research at the University of Kansas. And I'm going to hold the mic so you can hear me. We produced a report released last year of the Governor's Council on Tax Reform, the final report. And we have some updated numbers compared to those that were shared with you earlier from the proponents of the bill. First of all, we looked at the income tax, and we found that 20% of taxpayers, those earning $100,000 or more a year, pay 65% of the income taxes. Second, Kansas has the second highest sales tax burden in the region of about 3% of income. That's higher than the U.S. When other states in the U.S., Oklahoma is higher than us. Sales taxes are regressive. We show in the report that people with $25,000 of Kansas adjusted gross income spend 90% of their income. So 90% of their income is exposed to state and local taxes, and people with $150,000 or more in earnings spend only 30% of their earnings. And so much smaller amount of their money is exposed to the sales tax. So having served as the academic advisor on the Governor's Tax Council report, I want to provide negative testimony on Senate Bill 169 because it eliminates the progressivity of the tax system and will reduce tax revenues for the state general fund. The fiscal note in this bill is about $570 million a year once it's fully implemented. But there's another bill floating around, Senate Bill 33, that has a $440 million fiscal note in fiscal year 25. Combine those two numbers, you've got $1 billion in tax cuts. That is very reminiscent of the Brown-Back tax cuts in 2012, 2017. And there was a lot of information on sort of what happened. A lot of economists studied the impact of the Brownback tax cuts on the Kansas economy. We had no increase in population, no increase in employment. We had no increase in economic activity. The rationale for those tax cuts was to grow the economy, and our economy flatlined. Second, when we look at this tax cut in SB 169, we find that it benefits the very top earners. If you look at the top 5% of earners, married, filed jointly, they receive 51% of the benefit. The bottom 50% get 11%. Is that fair? I think not. Fourth, we in the governor's Council on Tax Reform suggested the preservation of the three-legged stool, where tax revenues were balanced between sales, property, and income. The income tax is the only progressive tax in those three. It goes up with income. However, they pay a higher level of taxes at a higher amount of taxes. The sales tax and the property tax are regressive. Finally, and this is not in my written testimony, if you cut taxes to a single rate, you are limiting the flexibility to deal with economic shocks and changes in the Kansas economy. For example, today we are dealing with the impact of a bank run. A week ago, I would have said the chance of a recession is 0. I have done a 180 because this bank run underscores the fragility of our financial system. If you couple that with the potential of default in the federal government this summer on defaulting on our credit, this bank run, 3 banks, are causing shudders in the market. What do you think is going to happen if the House and the President do not come to an agreement on default for our taxes? It would be catastrophic. Do you want to cut revenue at a time when we have so much uncertainty? That's a question I think that you need to ask yourselves. Finally, I want to offer an alternative for you to consider. There has been a long time since we've increased the standard deduction in our income taxes, and this would be a common sense way to provide tax relief to all Kansans by increasing the standard deduction. Thank you, and I'll answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. Committee, are there any questions for any of the opponents? Did you have one? Representative Bergkamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is for Dr. Gaither, if you don't mind. Good seeing you again in committee again. And I've been reading through that governor's report, a lot of good information out there. In your testimony, you referred to this bill as a reverse Robin Hood. So I'm just curious if we'd make this maybe a true Robin Hood. What would your top tax rate be for high earners?
I mean, our tax rate, I think, is fair right now, given how we do not have lower brackets that, those lower brackets change pretty quickly. And so we're taxing a lot of people at the flat tax at the higher rate right now. That's why increasing the standard deduction would be my way to go, keeping the tax rates the same as they are, but changing the deduction so that you're giving more relief.
And just one quick follow-up. So looking at our surrounding states, so it looks like Missouri's top marginal rate is 5.4%, where we're 5.7%. So are we losing out to Missouri, and are we not competitive with them due to being higher?
I don't think. I mean, we have seen no evidence that people move because of marginal tax rates. You see, I actually had a student do this research, and what we see is that retirees move because of taxes. So people on a fixed income will move. We want to attract prime-aged workers to this state. We have a full employment situation right now, and I think that what attracts families are family-friendly policies, not necessarily tax rates.
Thank you.
Representative Corbett.
Thank you, Chairman. This will be for Tim Graham. Thank you. The question I have is, without doing something where our sales, our income, and our property tax are actually, if you after the last census have driven 80 or 90 counties where they've lost population, and it seems like there's a reason for that. If it's not taxes, it's got to be spending. So the question I have for you, if we don't do something to try to get people to stay here, we're the third worst for retirement. People are leaving. We're sixth in outward migration. Don't you think this? Don't you think everybody should pay something for income tax? And don't you think that this would be at least one reason to stay here or move to Kansas?
Well, I believe currently everybody does pay income tax, and this bill would do away with that. I'm not following.
Well, what I'm trying to get at is with sales income and property tax being as high as they are, we have to find some reason to lower something, I would think, to keep people here.
Yeah, I appreciate you taking that approach to keeping people in Kansas. I think if you were to go out and start asking people why they're leaving or why they're not moving to Kansas, you're going to get a lot of different answers. And I'm not so sure that tax is going to be at the top of that list.
Thank you.
Representative Sawyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got a question for Dr. Ginther and one for Emily Fitch.
Hello.
Hi. Thank you, Dr. Ginther. I agree with you. I think the best income tax policy would be to increase a standard deduction. Do you have any suggestions on how much we should do that? Or
We talked about that in the report, and I didn't review those numbers, but we could come up with those suggestions. I do think that, the point made about inflation pushing people up, our trigger for our lower rates kick in really quick. And then we're paying that highest rate for a relatively low income. So I think that if you increase the standard deduction, especially for the low income earners, it's going to fight against that. What happens when you have a flat rate is you also eliminate the elasticity of tax revenue, right? Because you're only paying one rate. And so you want taxes to go up with economic growth. And if you push it down to just a single rate, the elasticity of your tax system will ultimately result in revenue shortages, which is kind of what we saw with the Brownback's tax cuts.
Certainly did. Thank you. Then Emily Fitch. Thank you. In your testimony, you say that the lowest 20% of Kansans pay 10.7% of their income in state taxes. That's when you combine income, property, and sales tax. And then you say the top 1% only pays an effective rate of 7.4%. Where do you get that information?
That is from the Institute for Taxation and Economic Policy. They have a Who Pays report that has not been updated yet this year, but I reached out to them and they were able to update those numbers for me. Okay. So it does reflect the change from last year with the food sales tax.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Committee, any further questions for the opponents? Seeing none, is there anyone else wishing to appear before the committee as an opponent? Seeing none, did Dan Murray ever make it back in? I didn't want to miss him. So, okay, at this time we'll go ahead and close the hearing on Senate Bill 169 and move on to our next item of business, hearing on Senate Bill 248. And I would turn first to the revisor's office for an overview.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senate Bill 248 would exempt sales of food and food ingredients that are currently taxed at the 4% rate. This would be an exemption from all sales of compensated use tax in Kansas. This would commence January 1 of 2024. Additionally, the scheduled transfer to the state highway fund from revenues generated by sales and use tax will accelerate so that 18% of these revenues would transfer commencing January 1 of 2024. Currently, the transfer is set at 17%. It kind of is a separate provision of the bill. There'd be a sales tax exemption for the Kansas State School of the Blind, for the blind, excuse me, and the Kansas State School for the Deaf for the erection, construction, repair, enlargement, or equipment of buildings used primarily for human habitation. And with that, I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you. Committee, are there any questions? Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in looking over some of the opponent written testimony, a lot of them seem to be saying that they've enacted local sales tax under home rule authority and that this bill would take away their home rule authority. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't know about home rule authority, but essentially exemptions are apply across the board. So currently we don't, the sales tax on food is not an exemption. It's a decreased rate of the state. Full sales tax exemptions are applied for both the state and local rates. So it would be essentially, yes, it would be an exemption from all sales or use taxes.
So it would take away their home rule authority to impose taxes on the items discussed in the bill.
I mean, there would not be any sales. They wouldn't have any authority to levy a sales tax. That is correct.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If I could clarify, they would still have the authority to levy their local sales tax rate. It's just the goods that it is applied to. You know, last year we did a sales tax exemption on fencing and materials in response to the fires, the wildfire disasters. You know, every single exemption that we pass in this building affects everybody when it's a full exemption. So, Representative Hoheisel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for that overview. One quick question. Was the local sales tax exemption, was that put in the original bill or was that amended in on the Senate floor?
I might be able to answer that. I believe Senate Bill 248, as it came out of committee, had a different definition for food. And I believe it was just 0% on the statewide rate. I believe it was amended on the floor to retain the existing definition of food and food ingredients in statute right now, but then it just created a complete exemption at the state and local level.
That was on the Senate floor.
I believe so,
okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, do you want to? Eddie might be correcting me on this.
Yeah, coming out of the Senate Assessment and Taxation Committee, the bill provided for an exemption for what it defined to be healthy foods. So it was an exemption there, but it did not use the same definition of food that is found in this bill.
But again, just for clarification, but the local sales tax piece was amended on the Senate floor. Or
no, it was a full exemption coming out of committee.
Oh, coming out of committee. Okay,
yes.
Got it. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any further questions? Representative Corbett?
This may be for Eddie also. How many other states would there be that are in this 0% situation for like this bill would be? Are there any other states that go this far? Are there other states that have zero sales tax on food?
There are some. During the testimony. I'll track down a list and get a number for you.
Thank you.
If I remember right from our discussion last year, I think there's only 13 states that actually tax food at different rates. But if there's no further questions for the revisor, thank you, Adam. And next, I'd welcome Kathleen for a review of the fiscal note.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, Kathleen Smith with the Department of Revenue. Senate Bill 248, as amended by Senate Committee of the Whole, would decrease state revenues by $118.5 million in fiscal year 2024. Of that total, the SGF is estimated to decrease by $115.5 million, and the State Highway Fund is estimated to decrease by $3 million. It's also estimated to decrease local tax revenues. However, the specific amount was not calculated by the Department of Revenue. With that, Mr. Chairman, I would stand for questions.
Thank you. Representative Hoheisel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for that overview. Is there any way we can get a calculation from you guys on the impact to the local?
I think it's going to vary by local, county, and city, depending on the businesses that they have in their district or in their area. So right now, what we use for statewide is 15% of the total collections. But with the locals, it varies so widely that we could not come up with an estimate. I would assume the locals would be able to give you that information, but you'd have to go with each one of them to find out.
Mr. If I may have a request, is there any way we can see the last 3 years, the local sales tax that was paid out the last 3 years? Okay,
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Further questions for Kathleen? Seeing none, thank you for that. At this time, we will open up proponent section testimony and welcome first to committee, John McCormick. Welcome to committee, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, and committee members, thank you for allowing me to speak in front of you for my members and the people of Kansas. I'm up here to ask you to support 248 as defined now. I'm glad we're not in the healthy food definition business, because there's not that many healthy food items in the grocery department, I will tell you. It's either got too much salt or it's got too much sugar or whatever. So, last year you voted 114-3 in this body to lower the tax over a number of years. Food prices were pretty high last year. We were all talking about it. Well, it's worse this year. And there's also something happening. I eat Atkins bars in the morning with my coffee, and the package is this big. And the product used to be this big. It fit the package. And now I can take almost a third of that package and fold it over. So not only are customers paying higher prices, but they're getting less product, okay? So in order to help the Kansans that are buying food right now, I'd like you to take the food and food ingredients to zero as soon as you possibly can. I have to stand neutral on the exemption of local and county taxes because of the tax base that the local supermarket provides to that community. And I've got a few retailers that I'm going to quote here. They're concerned about the harm of their community, both the people and their business. Rich Riswick, Jamboree Foods. He's up in the Northwest, Norton, Hill City, Atwood, Oakley, Hoxie, and Ness City. Quote, as a supporter of multiple rural communities, I also appreciate the challenges that our city and county elected officials face in their fiscal responsibilities. I will be neutral. And he goes on, talks about the concern for the community. The Flourish family out of Clay Center has 5 rural stores. Quote, I believe we need to remain neutral or even be keep the local sales tax, even though it's more of a hassle for us to flag items correctly. The state of Nebraska has 0% local sales tax on food. However, their property tax mill rate much higher. They fee us to death. Fee for this or that, license for this or that. The sales tax is a better, evenly spread tax. I much prefer the hassle of collecting and remitting sales tax rather than deal with all of the fees and higher business taxes. I checked with our local government on this topic this morning. Clay Center in particular has 2 outstanding bonds that they have a 0.5-cent sales tax on for both to repay it. The first one is our community swimming pool activity center. The second is for updating the streets. Both have been very beneficial to the town and Rays. The swimming pool during the summer brings in families, even from other counties, to spend the day, and they stop and shop at the grocery store. The pool purchases, most for their concessions, come from us, Rays. We cut them a huge deal, close quote. To summarize, I would love for you to support Senate Bill 248, lowering the food sales tax. And I would ask you to be wary of the concerns that my members have on exempting the local taxes on food and food ingredients. With that, thank you for your time today, and thank you for your service to the people of Kansas.
Thank you for your testimony. Okay. I do have one more in-person conferee, Rich Reiswick. Is he here today? John? Okay. I show no other proponents. Is there anyone else wishing to appear as a proponent? If not, John, you might have to come up. Are there any questions for the proponents? John, I have one question for you. Looking at the local sales tax rate, if you have, one of my biggest reasons for voting for the elimination of sales tax on food was because it really puts our retailers at a competitive disadvantage. Do you know of any studies or any information that anybody has looked at that shows at what point do you actually change consumer behavior? If we have a local sales tax rate of 3% total, is that 3% still going to be enough to drive someone to go across that border to do their shopping if they live right on a border town? Do you have any information or any feel for what, if it's just 1%, that's probably not going to drive consumer behavior, but at what level does that kind of tip and you start to lose some business?
I'm not sure if I was asked this question in this committee or the Senate committee, but I was asked last year the same question. And I think it's up to the customer. It depends on what else they might want to buy across the state line. I don't have any survey or study on that. We know that they're buying more than just groceries when they go across the state line. So I can't answer that.
Okay. That's very good. Thank you. Representative Corbett.
Thank you, Chairman. You roughly know how much money the average family might spend a month on groceries?
I don't have that information, no. I can get it.
I know. The other question I have, how do you think these other 37 states make this work? And we can't seem to figure it out.
Can you repeat that again?
What I'm asking you is, 37 states right now collect no sales tax on food. What do you think they're doing that we can't seem to accomplish here in Kansas?
I'd have to study their tax structure and you'd have to make a list of all the things they do. I mean, you have to run your state. You have to have enough money to run your state.
And last question, if you think you put it on the ballot where in every county you might work in, would you like to eliminate sales tax on food? Do you think your voters in your county or city would vote no?
That's a good question. I don't know. Maybe the socioeconomic makeup of the particular district might have an influence on that. I'm not sure.
Thank you.
Committee, any further questions? Seeing none, thank you again for your testimony.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
This time we'll open up the opponent section of testimony on Senate Bill 248 and welcome first to committee Representative Fairchild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to testify on this bill today. I've been a strong proponent of repealing the state sales tax on food since I first started running for office. And I do think we need to do that. I'm just strongly opposed to the part of the bill that prohibits the cities and counties from taxing food. Simply put, we don't have to do it that way. Last year, we passed the bill to phase out the state sales tax on food, and we didn't mess with the counties at all in that bill. In that bill, we simply phased out the state sales tax on food, and we didn't apply that same exemption to the counties. As mentioned earlier, there's going to be a big difference from county to county in the amount of revenue that the counties collect. And in our rural communities, we get a much bigger percentage of our revenue from food sales taxes than they do in the bigger cities. In Johnson County, they have a lot more retail businesses. But, in our rural communities, we just have, our grocery stores where we get a large percentage of our local sales tax revenue. We just don't have all the retail sales that they do in the bigger cities. And so this is going to be a much bigger hit on our rural communities as far as the amount of tax revenue that we're going to lose. And so I just think that's something that people need to keep in mind, that it's going to vary a lot from county to county, that it may be 15% of the total tax revenue, sales tax revenue statewide, but in our rural communities, it may be closer to like 40%. It's just a much bigger percentage in our rural communities. In my community, we have different projects that are funded through sales taxes. We have a 1% sales tax that helps fund our local grocery store in St. John that was built just a few years ago. We also, in Stafford, they passed a 1% sales tax to help fund their city pool, and their city manager reached out to me recently, and she told me that if we were to pass this bill, that it exempts the sales tax on food and prohibits the cities and counties from taxing food, that they would have a lot of trouble making their bond payments on the swimming pool. I just think, that's something that's going to happen all across the state. I also had a city commissioner from Sterling in my district reach out to me and say, this is going to cost us a lot of revenue, and if we don't, or if we do pass this, they might not even be able to fund their police officers in Sterling unless they were to make up for the revenue somehow else by raising the leftover, the rest of the sales tax, or raising property taxes. And I think that's another problem that this could cause, that it'll probably just end up increasing property taxes, because I don't think that they're going to cut spending when they have a reduction in revenue. I think they're just going to resort to raising property taxes. And the people in my district complain to me about property taxes more than they complain about any other tax. They don't complain to me much about income taxes or sales taxes, but they complain a lot about property taxes. And obviously, rising property tax rates are a huge problem in our state. And I think if we were to pass this bill that prohibits the counties and cities from taxing food, we would just see a significant increase in property taxes in Kansas. And I don't think that's the direction that we want to go in. Also, it seemed to me like when the Senate passed this, it seemed like they were doing it more from a partisan perspective, because they were basically just saying, well, Governor Kelly doesn't actually support completely repealing the sales tax on food because she wants to keep it for the counties and the cities. Well, I just think they were looking at it more from a partisan perspective than what's actually good for our state, basically just saying, well, we're going to pass this, we're going to get Governor Kelly to veto the bill and then make her look bad. Well, that's not the way that we should be doing things up here. We should, as representatives, we should simply strive to do what's best for the people of our state. We should strive to serve our constituents and try to enact policies that are best for the people of our state. And so I think that's what we should do, and we should just try to stay away from the partisan politics of it as much as we can. So I think that's basically all I have, but I think I would just request that the committee pass an amendment to do away with the part that exempts or that prohibits the counties and cities from taxing food. Like I said, I do support the part of the bill that repeals the state sales tax on food, so I would just request that the committee add an amendment to the bill that gets rid of the part of the bill that prohibits the counties and cities from taxing food, and then let's just go ahead and pass this bill that completely and immediately repeals the state sales tax on food. So I'll stand for questions.
Our next conferee would be Carolyn Dunn. Welcome to committee.
Thank you. I am Carolyn Dunn with Stafford County Economic Development. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. Representative Fairchild does represent our county, so I will try not to repeat what he has stated, but I would like to give some examples of how our county will probably be a prime example of some unintended consequences of the portion of the bill that affects local taxes passed. As he highlighted, the city of Stafford specifically voted. You asked about would citizens vote for this. The citizens of Stafford did specifically vote to pass a 1% sales tax in 2018 to fund the creation of a municipal swimming pool. The grocery store is one of the two largest collectors of sales tax in the town. And as he said, we would have trouble meeting bond payments if that tax were removed. But the project that holds even more irony is the grocery store in St. John. In 2016, we became one of those towns that lost its only grocery store, which elicited quite a strong response from citizens of our town because we feel like that's one of those strategic businesses. If you don't have a grocery store, it becomes difficult to, maintain all of the services that make a town a town. So we had a strong community effort to find a way to keep a grocery store. It involved building a new building. We cobbled together 14 different sources of finance to make that happen, including a tax increment finance district that our citizens specifically voted in a 1% tax to have the local tax that fed into that. That TIF district includes both property and sales tax. The sales tax portion of it represents about 25% of the total payments that we collect from various sources: rent, property tax rebate, fee on the fuel. The sales tax from the TIF is about 25% of our total debt obligation, or the payments that we use to meet our debt obligation each year. It would very much undermine our ability to carry out this plan for the next 20 years, which is right now going along just fine. I think there's some irony in the idea that when we were so sure that a grocery store was needed for the town's survival, part of that was also because the nature of having a local grocery store serves a low-income population, which is often not as mobile to go to towns farther away for essentials. And I'm aware of the idea that reducing sales tax is sometimes justified by the nature of it being a regressive tax. But in our case, eliminating it would be counterproductive for exactly that low-income population. Another piece of irony is that leaders from our community asked this committee 5 years ago to exempt the construction of our grocery store from sales tax on construction materials. We were not asking for an organization-based exemption, and even though there are many of those on record, as you well know, we were looking for just a one-time exemption for the project to save about $200,000 on the cost of construction. The state didn't see fit to grant that exemption, and some of the rationale I heard was that the legislature did not want to further carve out specific exemptions to the sales tax code, which is already too piecemeal. We accepted that. The community instead paid attorneys about $30,000 to issue an IRB, and which carries with it a project-based sales tax exemption. But I think that philosophy that was in place then, that we should exercise restraint in carving out specific restrictions, should apply now as well. And finally, I can appreciate the political philosophy that wants to reduce the scope of government and the level of taxation. And I can surmise that some of that motivation may be behind this proposal. But for us, it misses that mark. For this rural area, it feels like yet another battle in which the arbitrary rules of government make it harder to live our lives and run our communities. I don't think that's the intent of this committee. I know some of you personally, and I know that you come to this with a desire to serve our state and do good things. So I don't think that's your intent. So in that With that spirit, I ask you to actively vote against this and do what you can to make sure that it doesn't get added in committee or in conference rather. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Our next conferee is Lance Onstadt. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Lance Onstadt, Assistant City Administrator for the City of Andover, Kansas. Excuse me, representing Mayor Mr. Ronnie Price, who's in attendance with me today, and the entire City Council. Our intention here today is to enter testimony in opposition of Senate Bill 248, specifically the elimination of the provision allowing for local sales and use taxes to apply to all sales of food and ingredients. So for those of you that are not familiar, the city of Andover is located along the US 54-400 corridor, has a population of approximately 15,500 residents, a school district that includes over 50,000 residents, is the largest city in Butler County, and the third largest city in the Wichita metropolitan area. And at 31% growth in residents since 2010, the city of Andover is the fastest growing city in the state of Kansas. For that reason, we think it's important for us to offer testimony on this proposed legislation. As you might expect from the city's growth profile, the city has a long tradition of strategic long-range planning and professional financial management. This growth that we've experienced, this intense growth, puts an enormous amount of pressure on the public services that we're asked to provide. Skilled planning is vital to ensure that the city retains the second lowest mill levy in the region, behind only Wichita. And the city has worked diligently on this management of this historical growth, while also preparing ourselves for the same or more growth over the next 10 years. Within the last 4 years alone, the city has completed multiple long-range planning projects. We've completed a wastewater treatment and collection master plan, a comprehensive study of our fire and rescue services, a police department staffing study, a 5-year citywide organizational strategic plan, parks and recreation system master plan, and we are currently expecting to have our next 10-year comprehensive development plan reviewed and approved by our governing body this summer. All of which of these plans included significant community engagement with the primary goal of strategically planning our city's future and the vision of the residents that live there. In addition to establishing work priorities for myself and my staff, these plans try to link that with our financial strategies. So a salient feature of these long-term operating and capital financial strategies includes the diversification of revenue sources that lends itself to primarily controlling property taxes. The city currently has 2 1-cent sales taxes. One was approved in 1991 and has been in effect since, and it's dedicated to street maintenance and improvements. So 2 notable projects that sales tax is currently funding is the city's local match requirement for the state's Eisenhower Legacy Transportation Program's East Kellogg K96 to 159th Street project. That local match is approximately $2.5 million. The second phase of that project will also be funded using this revenue source and carries an estimated cost of $6.1 million. Secondly, the city was appreciative to receive 2 Building a Stronger Economy or BASE grants for major transportation projects within the city. The estimate for those 2 major regional transportation projects is $21.6 million, leaving a local requirement of $13.1 million to be funded with sales tax receipts. Also, in Andover voters in 2021, 68% of Andover voters did approve an additional temporary 1-cent sales tax to fund nearly $27.5 million worth of projects. These projects include the construction of the city's second fire station, remodeling of the existing fire station, which was originally built in 1994 before the city of Andover had a 24/7 professional fire service. Complete overhaul and reconstruction of what we call our 13th Street Sports Park, which is a 60-acre regional park that serves the region, as you might suspect, and the construction of a park, the city's first park south of US 54-400. For financial implications, per our analysis, and to your point of the impacts being extremely localized, our analysis, 25% of the city's sales tax revenue is derived from the sales of food and ingredients. The projects that I've just talked about are solely funded with sales tax revenue. Current estimates, $1.6 million of annual revenue would not be realized if the current legislation was approved. Importantly, the projects that I've already talked about are in construction. We can't shelve them, we can't postpone them, we can't delay them, we can't reduce the scope of these projects. This creates a nearly impossible decision for the Andover governing body. Increased property taxes is about the only arrow that we have in our quiver. In order to fund these projects, it is estimated that our property tax would need to increase 8 mills, or 20%, or to cut other services that the city provides or that is funded with property tax. So Andover voters historically approved temporary sales tax because it's not only paid by City of Andover residents, but those that utilize these services. The city's library, street maintenance facility, FEMA-rated restrooms that were put to use within the past year, City Hall and multiple Andover fire rescue apparatus have all been funded using sales tax revenues. So because of this negative fiscal impact that will be placed upon the City of Andover residents, we are seeking an amendment to keep the local sales tax whole. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Our next conferee, I'd like to welcome Spencer Duncan.
Thank you, Chair. Spencer Duncan, League of Kansas Municipalities, and I will be brief and not repeat anything you've heard or going to hear. A couple quick points. When this bill was originally put into the Senate, it only attached to healthy food, which, as you heard, is a very small amount of products. So while we didn't like that either, and it did remove the local portion, it was a much smaller number. After the Senate made this amendment and passed out, they did a post-mortem. Legislative research on the Senate side has indicated that at minimum, this is an impact of $180 million to the locals. That's using the 15% number that you heard from the Department of Revenue. I will also tell you one question that was asked. Even in Missouri, if you go to the Department of Revenue, Missouri Department of Revenue site, they keep all local sales taxes whole on their food reduction of sales tax. So we weren't out of the norm when this decision was made a year ago. So the Senate didn't get to hear all of this information, which is partially why you're being flooded with it today. So the last 2 points I'll make, and I know in this day and age this seems a little trite, but we all made a deal. We all came together and had this conversation the last 2 years about what this was going to look like and how it was going to be implemented. And moving the date, great, that doesn't have a big impact. But this sort of was already hashed out. We're less than 3 months into it. And making that change at this point really throws a wrench, as you've heard and will hear, to what the cities have done for budgeting purposes. And the last point is all of our local sales tax under state law are voter approved. I'm on the city council in Topeka. I can't just institute a sales tax. I have to go to my voters, explain where it's going to go, and ask them to vote for it. So when you make this change, you are impacting a decision the voters made about how they want to be taxed, where they want that money to go, and what it means for an offset, as you heard, to their property taxes. So keep those things in mind as you move forward, and thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you for your testimony. Next conferee is Stephen Wade. Welcome to committee.
Good afternoon. Stephen Wade, City Manager for the City of Topeka. I'd like to thank Chairman Smith and the committee for allowing the City of Topeka the opportunity to testify in opposition to Senate Bill 248. No one likes sales taxes, but most like property taxes even less. A conservative estimate is that the elimination of the local sales tax on groceries would be a loss of $5 to $6 million to the City of Topeka's general fund, and an additional $2.5 million specifically to the city's street fund. To put this into perspective, that's 25% of our budget for law enforcement officers and the equivalent of an 8 mil increase in property tax. One might contend that this is just a way to make government smaller,
but $2.5 million in loss to the city's street fund is almost exclusively paid to local businesses. The indirect impact to the community through the loss of $6 million in wages is an additional 35%, or about $8 million. With that, I'll stand for questions when appropriate.
Thank you for your testimony. Now, our next conferee is Mark Manning, joining us via WebEx.
Good morning, Chairman Smith. Let me see if I can, okay, we got the video on. Good morning, Chairman Smith, members of the committee. My name is Mark Manning, and I am the Director of Finance for the City of Wichita, Kansas. Thank you for the opportunity today to voice our concerns about Senate Bill 248. I'll be brief today because, again, you've heard from other conferees, and we share a lot of the same opinions that they shared as well. The city of Wichita does not actually have a city sales tax. However, we receive a significant portion of the revenue from the 1% countywide tax that Sedgwick County levies. We've received funding from that tax since 1985 when it was approved by a referendum here in Sedgwick County. We use those revenues to maintain a relatively flat mill levy rate, and we use them to fund community priorities like public safety and road maintenance and freeway improvements. Senate Bill 248, we believe, would result in a revenue loss of at least $11 million annually for the city of Wichita, and that would jeopardize our efforts in those areas. And I would point out that we do not have the data and the information that the Kansas Department of Revenue has, so it's a little bit of a challenge for us to accurately estimate the revenue loss. I would tell you that is a very conservative loss. The Department of Revenue assumed 15%. That number that I gave you is assuming about 13% in Wichita. So it could be significantly more than that, but we know it would be a sizable reduction in our revenues. Now, pavement and street improvements are important to our residents here in Wichita. We survey them frequently, and that's typically the second highest priority that residents want us to spend our funding on. And the city, with the help from the state and the county, has used sales tax revenues to complete over 14 miles of US 400, or Kellogg Avenue here in Wichita, to freeway standards. We plan to spend another $141 million on street maintenance over the next 10 years, again, reflecting the priorities of our residents here. And the gentleman from Andover mentioned East Kellogg. The city of Wichita is a participant in that project as well. Our match share that we will use local sales tax on for that is about $14 million. We're also joined with the state on the North Junction project, which is very important to our region. And our portion of that will be about $13 million. So we rely on the sales tax revenue for many of these freeway improvements. Secondly, we also use sales tax revenues to fund general fund activities in our operating budget. Again, we fund the things that are important to residents like public safety and maintenance and quality life and things like that. Recently, we adopted a budget for 2023 that included some enhancements like enhanced mental health services and police responses. We added firefighters. We boosted firefighter wages. We added some funding to improve maintenance of our public parklands. And again, all of that was based on what we estimated would be available from local sales tax. And those go into our general fund. Again, those will fund those efforts. Our ability to fund those initiatives will be directly impacted by the lost revenue caused by Senate Bill 248 if it is in fact approved in its current form. And finally, I'll point out that the city is an active but very prudent borrower. We issue bonds to fund capital improvement projects, general obligation bonds, and sometimes sales tax revenue bonds. We maintain an excellent bond rating. We're AA+ rated, but we believe that Senate Bill 248 would cause concern among the rating agencies. We don't like our rating agencies to be concerned because when they're concerned, sometimes that could result in adverse rating agency actions, which is an outcome that we would not like because that will increase our interest costs for our local taxpayers and would also reduce our capacity to fund additional projects. So in conclusion, I would say that the City of Wichita highly values the efforts of the legislature to support local communities, specifically here in Wichita. This has meant continued support of our freeway improvements as well as enhanced economic vitality projects. So we're very appreciative of that. However, Senate Bill 248 would jeopardize our ability we believe, to respond to resident priorities and to fund improvements in similar areas. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be happy to answer any questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you for your testimony. Next, I'd like to welcome Jay Hall, Kansas Association of Counties. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Jay Hall, Deputy Director and General Counsel for the Kansas Association of Counties. I won't rehash the points that you've already heard. I was actually sitting there listening to the proponent, and when even the proponent is saying that we should not eliminate the local portion of sales taxes, I feel like we have a pretty safe position as the Kansas Association of Counties to also advocate that the local portion should not be eliminated. As you've heard, this funds a lot of critical projects at the local level. Some of our counties use their funding for things like EMS and I mean, things that you would not want to have to do without. And if they were to lose these types of revenues, that would fall back on the property taxes because, again, you can't do without EMS. You can't do without your county jail. You can't do without your emergency management communications. You can't do without those things. And so it's important that they have those revenues. I'd also observe that counties have already lost a lot of different types of revenues, and we don't really have a lot of things to draw from. And so losing this type of revenue would force that on the property tax. And with that, I'll stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you for your testimony. Our next conferee is Alan Dinkle. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee members. I'm going to be brief for a lot of the numbers. In the case of Junction City, and I used the 14%, Senator Longmire told me 14.6. I rounded down. 14% means about $1.8 million lost revenue to the city of Junction City. I called over to Geary County, since I own my house that's in both the city and the county. It's probably about another increase as well. It comes out to about 13 mills, 9 from the city, 4 or 5 from the county. That's 14 mills increases to taxpayers in our town. We're a unique city in the fact that we have 2% local sales tax, one general and one for debt service. Of course, you know, a lot of people know the city just got debt problems when the big red money was supposed to come back. It didn't happen. There was special state legislation for us to go above the state debt limit, and we've gotten it back down. But you know what? If we make a cut, and I still have bond payments to make the next 4, 5, 6 years, I got to cut somewhere else. At 1% goes to death. My bondholders say, nope, we can't pay you. The state made us cut back our food sales tax. We're going to lose it. You don't get the money. It don't work that way. It'll be devastating to us. Also, what's unique to us is that we have a high amount of rental property in our town. So yes, if you ask the voters in our community, do you want to cut the sales tax on food to zero? They may say yes. But also that's because we have a high amount of renters in our community. The property owners would have the brunt of it. They'd either have to raise rates to cover the extra taxes, or they'd have to do without. And it becomes just a real mess in that. And again, I don't think there's anybody that doesn't want the sales tax down to the state of zero. There's no problem with that. But the local and the impact it has, I think, would be devastating. And therefore, I hope that you don't pass that bill out in the form it is right now. I know there's been talks about making a deal down the road for giving some money, covering the cities, at least in the Senate side, covering the cities for a couple of years. We've made deals before, and they haven't worked out well for the cities and increases property tax all the time. I'll stand for questions when needed.
Okay. Thank you for your testimony. Our next conferee is Sarah Kaler. Welcome to committee.
Hello. Good afternoon. I know I'm standing between you and the rest of your day, whatever the day looks like. But good afternoon, Chairperson Smith, Vice Chair Burkamp, and Ranking Member Sawyer, and all of the committee members here. My name is Sarah Kaler, and I send you greetings from the City of Ottawa. As a City Commissioner, from the City of Ottawa. Thank you for allowing me to address Senate Bill 248. Let me begin by noting that your commitment to lighten the financial burden for Kansans is a notable effort. As a local elected official, I too bear that responsibility of being fiscally responsible with every single dollar that we bring into the city of Ottawa. When I took my oath of office nearly 12 years ago to serve the city of Ottawa, I swore to support the U.S. Constitution and the Constitution of the state of Kansas. I continue to take that oath very seriously, and I know you do too. As Representative Sanders indicated, when Senate Bill 248 was amended to eliminate local sales tax on food, that provision infringed on the voter-approved constitutional home rule power for cities to determine their own local affairs, including the levying of taxes. Setting aside any special taxing districts, which I'll come back to in just a minute, voters approved all of the local sales tax for the city of Ottawa. Ignoring the voice of the voter is simply unacceptable. Furthermore, as a consequence of eliminating the local sales tax on food, no provisions have been made for special taxing districts such as CIDs, TIFs, which are created to stimulate economic growth in rural communities like Ottawa, like Atchison, like Liberal, like Hayes. As it is here in the State House, the City of Ottawa has begun the budgeting process for 2023. In fact, this conversation regarding the budget was actually started while I was here with you this afternoon. Due to potential catastrophic consequences, I even hate saying the word, of Senate Bill 248, I have worked with our finance director to identify potential downsizing options if this bill were to be passed out, signed by the governor. And thanks to my dear mother, who is a teacher, I brought visuals for you today. So, Representative Fairchild points out that there are many things that could go wrong with this. If the city of Ottawa is forced to make tough decisions that are listed in Senate Bill 248, the first option is to, well, we can eliminate the police department. As stated in my testimony, the loss of sales tax on food is a loss of over $3 million, which is equivalent to the annual budget of this department. As you know, local police departments are committed to community policing, including police officers and citizens who work together to address safety and promote positive quality of life for all of our nearly 13,000 citizens. Is this an option? Absolutely not. Okay, well, maybe the second option's better. Let's eliminate the Ottawa Fire Department. And not only do we have to eliminate the Ottawa Fire Department, we'll also have to eliminate all employee benefit programs for all of our nearly 200 employees for the city of Ottawa. Is that an option? No, absolutely not. So neither the elimination of the Ottawa Police Department or elimination of the Ottawa Fire Department and the city benefits are a viable option. So what's our last option? Well, here's the great option, and I know that you're probably all going to really love this. Let's increase the property taxes for the citizens of Ottawa by 27.25 mils. I can't personally afford that. That is a 60% increase, which will provide zero merit or pay increases for one employee for the city next year, will not count for any increases in healthcare benefits, and will not count for the rising cost of doing business in this ever-changing economy. In addition, this dramatic increase to the taxpayer does not take into account that inevitably Franklin County will also have to raise their mills because they have a part of the sales tax in our community. In closing, I know each of you want to see Kansas grow. Together with our elected officials, we all want to grow the tax base for our state and encourage economic growth in our community, including mine. With great respect to each of you, I request that you oppose Senate Bill 248 as long as that bill includes the removal of local sales tax. Thank you, and I'll take your questions later.
Thank you for your testimony. Our next conferee is Tim Dannenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Tim Dannenberg, the city of Olathe. I'm doing my best to take notes in the back, trying not to be repetitive, but I think, unfortunately, the theme that I will share is what you have been hearing as well. Like other communities, and like I heard referenced before this committee, we too have the three-legged stool in how we fund government. And as presented, this would be an $8 million hit to the city of Olathe's general fund. That's $8 million, which I don't want to hit the police and firefighter issue too hard, but that's something we can all relate to. That's 70 positions in the city of Olathe. And fundamentally, there is a level of service that our residents expect and deserve. And this presents a quandary for us in a fundamental shift of how we use our three-legged stool. And it is a shift from sales tax, $8 million in sales tax, to dramatically limiting our ability and flexibility to make any adjustments to the mill rate as we did in the past year. We were fortunate and were able to make a reduction, and there is a good chance going forward we can do that this year, but obviously this $8 million would take that completely off the table for us. There is a level of service that it would be difficult to anticipate how we would absorb that $8 million hit, but it would certainly limit us, and it would absolutely have impact on the way we provide service to our customers and our taxpayers. And with that, I'll look forward to standing for any questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you for your testimony. The last conferee I show in person as an opponent is Mike Taylor.
Thank you, Chairman and committee. So much what I was going to say has already been said, so I'm going to jump ahead and give you a quick history lesson. Since 2003, the legislature has taken away the local ad valorem tax reduction fund, the special city county revenue fund, machinery equipment tax, the mortgage revenue fees, and switches in Department of Revenue on DMV. I know in my county, Wyandotte County, it cost us $250,000 to hire new staff just to take care of the duties the state used to do. My point is, you cannot keep stealing our revenues and then complain about property taxes. It's just not fair. It's the only place we have to go. If you steal all of our other money, property taxes are what we have left. Thanks.
Is there anyone else wishing to appear as an opponent? Yes. We know you, but go ahead and state your name. For
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the chance to speak. My name is Jim Howell. I'm a Sedgwick County Commissioner. I come on behalf of the entire Board of County Commissioners. I did turn in my testimony. I apologize for not being on the conferee list, but I just wanted to say, number one, I don't need to repeat what the opponents have said today. I think the opponents did a really good job. I almost want to applaud them. I have 9 points. They've covered all my 9 points and then some. Without getting into the details, I think the reality is we are shifting from sales tax to property tax. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but that's where this ends up. We know, if you ask your constituents, would you rather pay a small sales tax that you voted for in 1985 on sales tax for local government, or would you like to see an increase in your property taxes? I promise you, I know the answer to that question. There's no question whatsoever. I know there's a fix that's coming. Let's just address, no one else has talked about this one thing, Mr. Chairman. Senate Bill 309, now that's not today, and I'll come testify on that when it comes. But Senate Bill 309 is going to be, you're going to hear her say, we have a fix. Go ahead and do this thing on local sales tax. We have a fix. We're going to refund or provide funding, if you will, to local governments to backfill their losses on local sales tax on food. It's not true. Let me give you a couple reasons why. I charted this. I don't know if you can see it from there. I'll hand some of these to the committee. You guys can have some of these. I have them for you all today. But we have significant growth in sales tax as the economy ebbs and flows. It's not a static number. The money that they set aside for the initial funding for Senate Bill 309 is $220 million. That's enough for 1 year. Then what? And by the way, that $220 million has another purpose this year for infrastructure projects across the state of Kansas. They're going to move it towards local sales tax to fund local governments instead. I understand that may be the plan. But then what? When the state runs out of money, then what? it's inevitable that this is not sustainable to do this. And I bring up LAVTR as an example. In fact, 309 gets rid of LAVTR off the books entirely, which is ironic to me. But having said that, sales tax is not static. It ebbs and flows. We have had about 2.2% increase in sales tax every year for the last 10 years. In fact, the last 2 years, it's gone up $8 million, which is much higher than 2.2%. The way 309 works, it actually looks for the losses and it refunds the amount of money that you lost and not having sales tax flowing for that 1 year. It doesn't count growth. So it's not a solution to the problem. In fact, it's a bad Band-Aid. I would just urge the committee. Now, let me just make one last point. As many other conferees have already said, the voters of Sedgwick County voted for the 1% sales tax to offset property tax and provide infrastructure. It's doing a great job. We would have higher property tax if it wasn't for the revenue coming in from the 1% sales tax. In fact, we have about a 6.5 mil decrease to Sedgwick County residents because of revenues from the Kansas Star Casino and our 1% sales tax. I'm grateful for those other sources of revenue. It gives us a more stable base for where tax revenue comes from. But you start meddling with the sales tax, it only has one place to go, and that's property tax. So I urge the committee, please take out that one piece. Otherwise, it's not a bad bill. And as a former speaker said, even the proponent today said the same thing. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the chance to speak. I'll stand for questions.
Is there anyone else wishing to appear as an opponent on Senate Bill 248? Seeing none, we will now open it up for questions for any of the opponents. Committee, are there any questions? Representative Wassinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is not a question. The city of Hayes back in the 90s eliminated their property tax for sales tax so that they could keep their mill levy so low. If this is allowed to happen for the local sales tax and taking away their local control, it's going to be devastating. So I ask that we don't support this to take away local control and take that portion out of this bill. Thank you.
Representative Sawyer.
Would Commissioner Howe come to the mic? This was actually before your time, I think. You were talking about, I thought you were going to talk about the Siegfried slider when you talked about how this wasn't going to work. But, when we got rid of the machinery and equipment, and affected the local, we were going to make it up to the locals.
It didn't happen.
It didn't happen. We fed it like 1 year and maybe partial the second. That was it. So it's called the Siegfried slider, but
right.
You do remember that then, maybe. But yeah, our history of making up revenue to locals is not very good.
May I, Chairman, answer that? I have a presentation I would love to share with you, or Representative Sawyer and others. Our CFO is tremendous, and she has a presentation. But if you really want to go back and look at what's happened between the state and local government, I'm going to just speak about Sedgwick County. I can't speak for other communities, but we've actually had 4 things I would reflect on that together, those 4 things in 14 years, we've lost $532 million in revenue. Now, one of those is huge. That's just Sedgwick County. One of those is huge. We have the mortgage filing fee, which, by the way, I was in state representative. I voted for that law. I still think it's good legislation. I'm not sorry we voted for it, but it's a huge loss of revenue to local government. Machine and equipment was the other one. That happened back, I think, about 10 years prior to that. We also have, of course, the city and county revenue sharing and the LAVTR. Together, those last 2 I just mentioned is $101 million to Sedgwick County. The mortgage fee is the greatest number, about $370 million. And the last piece was $56 million from machine and equipment. Together, that is $532 million in losses in 14 years. And so you wonder where, and by the way, that's not the only thing I would mention. We have 16 programs we operate on behalf of the state of Kansas. Revenue for those programs has gone down from the state of Kansas, and our property tax revenues had to go up to cover the cost. So you wonder why property taxes are high in Sedgwick County. That's it. We're doing the state's requirements. We have all these mandates. Revenue's gone down. Our property taxes had to go up to cover the cost. We had no choice. And so you start thinking about the squeeze on local government. It's not because we're inefficient. It's because we've done everything we possibly can. But somehow revenue's got to flow into local government, and this is just another little piece. Thank you. Thank you for the chance to speak.
Representative Helgerson.
Well,
Kind of should shut up, but I'm not. You can stay there, but let me tell you this discussion so that it's clear, and I won't have a chance to visit this many county officials and city officials again. 2003, I'm responsible. We were short of money, and I was in the Senate, and I came up with the bright idea of taking away the LABTR. And the majority of the Republicans in the Senate said, that's a good idea. All we have to do is change the language in the appropriation bill, and we can do it. I didn't know it was going to happen at the time, that it would, it would never go back. Now, I was trying to, because I'm in a little bit more senior position this year in a couple other areas, talking with some other legislators about it's time to put that back. Reduce property taxes is a way. And I'll tell you what a senior legislator told me. They said, last year when the federal money came, their county, I can't remember if it was a county or city that they referred to, used that money for salary increases rather than dealing with something else. One-time money for salary increases that then had this effect of upping your budget. Now, I know of other counties that did other things with one-time money that increased the expenditures in their annual budget this year and years to come. I don't know what the solution is, but I can really tell you, I happen to look at the general orders. And the general orders has the bill we passed out of here that dealt with 2 vehicles are free for anyone in the military and in the police or fire department. I think that's how the bill says. And I thought, what would be a great amendment? I changed that to every citizen gets 2 free vehicles. Can you imagine what the property tax impact would be? And the fiscal impact? But it wouldn't be the best policy. But we and you have to come to a solution in controlling the property taxes, and it has to be together and that means that the state's going to have to control its budget, and you're going to have to control your budget because we can't afford it, and we're going to get a rebellion in here soon. So I tell you all that because I've heard some great testimony about why bill is not going to go anywhere, and I agree it's not going to go anywhere with some of those aspects. But the problem's out there, and the problem's going to hit us in the face if we don't get it corrected soon. Thank you for your patience.
Further questions, committee? Seeing none, thank the conferees for their testimony. We do have 2 neutral testimonies. I'd like to welcome Scott Schneider. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name's Scott Schneider. I drove up last Friday for 2 hours to testify on a bill, hoping to get my 2 minutes, and I didn't. So I feel honored to be here at the end of the day, and I will try to hurry it up. With the Kansas Restaurant Hospitality Association, for 8 years, we asked for the food sales tax not to be bifurcated. The legislature decided that was the best policy, and we understand it. We're neutral on the underlying policy, but we come before you today, hopefully to present an argument that we think deserves some consideration. We think that the collection effort of the remaining food sales tax is extremely difficult with the definition that was passed last year. Our industry collects over $358 million annually. That's what we did last year. If we were in a private contract, parties in a private contract, I'd probably sit here and argue frustration of purpose from the Uniform Commercial Code or impossibility. I probably wouldn't go to force majeure, but I know some people do believe in legislators as being deities. But I have 2 solutions. I think moving forward, we've got 114 or 1,014 different sales tax jurisdictions across the state. Now we have 2 different food definitions, and the Department of Revenue put out a booklet that's 26 pages long with a very complicated definition that we have to comply with. We think the risk of compliance is so high that we would ask the committee to put a safe harbor in there on penalties and interest until we can figure this out. Alternatively, Senate Bill 41 would allow a retailer to collect a percentage up to a dollar amount because of the additional cost that it will take to update their point of sale system continuously. We think some small retailers, restaurants, Little Russia Chili Parlor, if you haven't been there, it's wonderful, don't have the point of sale system to differentiate between what's a cold cut sandwich and the jar of pickles that would be a grocery item and should be taxed at a different rate. We think the risk is there. We would ask the committee, you move forward, whether it's in conference or this bill, to consider some type of safe harbor, because what happens if you get into this penalty and interest mode as a private retailer, that can accrue to your personal situation also. So we think there's risk. We would ask the committee to look at that as you move forward. Thank you, and I'll stand for questions.
Thank you. I do have another neutral conferee, Donna Ginther. Welcome back to committee.
Thank you. I'll keep this brief. There were a few questions that came up in the previous testimony, and we have some data from the governor's Tax Reform Council report that can shed light on this. First of all, the average expenditures for a family of 4 annually on groceries range, depending on income, from about $7,700 to $9,200 per year. About between $500 and $600 in the state sales tax. Second, we've had 10% price inflation in the past year, so those numbers have risen to about $10,000 for the highest income households and $8,400 for a family of 4 at a lower income level. Second, there are 13 other states that tax food, and of the surrounding states, even though we're down to 4%, the only state that has a higher tax rate on food than Kansas is Oklahoma. And again, food price inflation has gone up quite a bit in the past year. So the food sales taxes, the reason I'm neutral on this bill is that food is a necessity, and we're taxing it. And I also want to mention that we are ranked 48th in the country in terms of providing SNAP benefits. So our low-income households don't get the same access to SNAP that they do in Missouri or Oklahoma. And this is because we have a lot of restrictions on access to SNAP. So our low-income households are feeling the effect of this very regressive tax. And so I am against having a regressive tax on food. That said, there's always a gotcha. When it comes to tax policy, there's always an opportunity cost, and the opportunity cost is to our local governments. Our local governments have property taxes. Property taxes are going up because housing values are going up, and people are going to get really angry when they get their tax assessments. So if you could figure out a way, it seems like from the discussion earlier that there hasn't been a good way to make up for lost revenue in our local governments. LATBRF has never really been fully funded, and other sort of opportunities to make up for that lost revenue leave local governments in a bind. So I'm neutral. I don't like regressive food taxes, but I don't like taking revenue streams away from local governments either. And I'll stand for questions. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Is there anyone else wishing to appear neutral on Senate Bill 248? Seeing none, we'll open up it for questions. Are there any questions for the neutral conferees? Representative Corbett.
It would be for Mr. Schneider.
Yes, sir.
So in the restaurant business, do you think it would be a great boost to think about eliminating sales tax on prepared food? Do you think that would help your industry?
I absolutely think it would be, and I testified that it would for 8 straight years. So
Keep your fingers crossed. Maybe you'll lose your fingers probably, but give it a try.
from your lips to God's ears. Thank you.
Any further questions, committee? Seeing none, we will close the hearing on Senate Bill 248. I want to say thank you to your patience for all the conferees. I'm not the kind of committee chair that likes to give people 2 minutes to get up there and say their piece. So we worked through everything efficiently today. We are a little bit late, so thank you for your patience, committee, and we are adjourned.